On the afternoon of April 17, 1964, a truck driver in San Francisco caught sight of a brand-new car sitting behind the glass of a Ford dealership showroom, and he was so completely distracted by what he saw that he drove his truck straight through the window. And that same week, a Chicago dealer had to lock his own front doors just to stop the crowd outside from crushing each other trying to get in. While in Pittsburgh, a dealer hoisted his only available unit onto a service lift simply to keep it away from the crowd, and found the mob pressed in so thick and so persistent that he couldn't get the car back down until after supper. And if that sounds like the kind of hysteria usually reserved for a rock concert or a movie premiere, that's exactly what it felt like. Because the car those crowds were fighting over was the Ford Mustang, and the launch itself had been staged with real theatrical ambition. Unveiled to the public at the New York World's Fair that same April afternoon, in front of enormous crowds, while simultaneously appearing in Ford showrooms nationwide. A coordinated release that felt less like a routine model year update and more like the debut of a genuine consumer phenomenon. And to understand what it was actually like to own one of these cars in that very first model year isn't just a story about horsepower and sheet metal, it's a story about what it felt like to be swept up in one of the most successful product launches in American history, and then to live with the very real, very human machine that came out the other side of all that hysteria. And the mania didn't come out of nowhere, because Ford had spent months building toward that April afternoon at the New York World's Fair, running a wave of television and print advertising for 3 full weeks before the car was even available. And on that very first day of sales, dealerships across the country wrote up an astonishing 22,000 orders before the sun went down, a number that would have been a strong result for an entire month for most cars of that era. An almost unbelievable pace of demand that caught even Ford's own sales planners off guard. And within just 4 months, Ford had already blown past its entire projected first-year sales target, moving roughly 120,000 units before the car had even reached its official 1965 model year in mid-August. And by the time the full first year of production wrapped, Ford had sold nearly 681,000 Mustangs, a figure so far beyond anything the company's own executives had dared to hope for that Lee Iacocca, the executive most associated with pushing the project forward, became something close to a national celebrity almost overnight. And part of what made this frenzy so remarkable is that the car itself, underneath all that stylish new sheet metal, was fundamentally an ordinary and unglamorous machine. Because Ford had built the Mustang on the humble underpinnings of the Falcon, its bargain basement compact sedan, essentially wrapping a genuinely inexpensive and mechanically simple platform inside a long hood, short deck body that looked like nothing else on the road. And that combination was precisely the genius of it, because it meant Ford could sell genuine excitement at a price point that fell well within reach of an ordinary working American, with the base model starting at just under $2,368 and a nicely equipped convertible landing around $2,557. Numbers that put the car within financial reach of young buyers, secretaries, teachers, and factory workers in a way that most stylish, sporty cars of the era simply weren't. And stepping into a showroom to actually spec one out in the spring of 1964 revealed just how much choice Ford had packed into that affordable starting price, because a buyer walking in could choose between a modest 101 horsepower straight 6-cylinder engine that returned genuinely reasonable fuel economy for the era, all the way up to a spirited 220 horsepower, 289 cubic inch V8 for buyers who wanted real performance. And Ford offered such an overwhelming menu of factory options: vinyl roofs, wire wheel covers, air conditioning, a genuine tachometer and clock combination, that surveys of period buyers found the vast majority walked out with a heavily optioned car rather than the bare-bones base model, a level of personalization that had rarely been offered to buyers at this price point before, meaning two seemingly identical Mustangs parked side by side in a driveway that summer could actually represent wildly different ownership experiences depending entirely on which boxes their original owner had checked. Meaning it meant genuinely different things to different families depending on whether the car had been ordered as an economical daily driver or as a genuine weekend performance machine, right down to small details like whether a family sedan buyer had opted for the quieter, more comfort-oriented six-cylinder and cruise-o-matic automatic combination, while a younger buyer down the street had checked every performance box available and driven home with a genuinely quick four-speed V8 car wearing nearly identical bodywork. And once that new Mustang actually left the dealership lot and became a daily reality rather than a showroom fantasy, owners discovered a car that was, in a lot of very real ways, still very much a product of 1964 engineering rather than some kind of automotive revolution, because underneath that dramatically styled body sat genuinely basic period hardware, standard drum brakes on all four corners that faded noticeably under hard or repeated use, a soft, comfort-tuned suspension that automotive journalists of the era consistently criticized for allowing the car to float and wallow at highway speeds, and manual steering on base models that many period reviewers described as frustratingly slow and heavy at low speeds, meaning the very same car that looked like a genuine sports car sitting still in a driveway could feel considerably less confident once a driver actually pushed it hard into a curve or needed to stop quickly in traffic, a gap between visual promise and mechanical reality that period owners generally learned to simply drive around rather than something most of them ever seriously complained about, and contemporary road tests from magazines like Road and Track and Motor Trend, while broadly enthusiastic about the styling and the sheer value the car represented, consistently pointed out that the cabin felt cramped for anyone sitting in the rear seats, that the flat, thinly padded bucket seats offered little real lateral support, and that the Falcon-sourced instrumentation felt sparse and somewhat cheap compared to the dramatic exterior styling surrounding it. And yet, none of that seemed to matter much to the people actually buying and driving these cars, because what the Mustang delivered wasn't really about outright competence by modern engineering standards. It was about an entirely new kind of emotional ownership experience that simply hadn't existed at this price point before. And one telling detail from period owners captures this perfectly, because getting gas in a brand new Mustang during 1964 and 1965 rarely stayed a simple errand, since strangers at the pump would routinely stop owners to ask questions, share stories about a neighbor or a cousin who had one in a different color, or simply admire the car up close, turning even a mundane fill-up into an impromptu public event. A genuinely unusual experience for what was, mechanically speaking, still a dressed-up economy car underneath. And that social visibility extended well beyond the gas station, too, because owners frequently described being waved down at stoplights by curious strangers, having teenagers on the sidewalk stop mid-conversation just to watch one drive past, and finding that parking a Mustang outside a diner or a drive-in movie theater almost guaranteed a small cluster of onlookers before the evening was through, and everyday reliability, once owners actually settled into life with these cars, generally proved to be a genuine strength rather than a weakness, because the Falcon-based mechanicals underpinning the Mustang had already been thoroughly proven in millions of miles of real-world use by the time the sportier body arrived, meaning the drivetrain itself tended to be sturdy and relatively easy for a competent home mechanic to service and maintain, even if some individual components, like the electrical charging system on the very earliest cars built before August of 1964, which used an older-style generator rather than the alternator that would arrive on later production cars, occasionally proved to be weak points that later owners would often upgrade. and owners who kept up with routine maintenance, regular oil changes, periodic tune-ups, and attentive care of that early generator system generally reported years of dependable, low-drama service from cars that were, underneath all the excitement, built from thoroughly proven and widely available Ford parts rather than anything exotic or difficult to source, and safety, by any modern measure, remained a genuine and largely accepted limitation of ownership rather than a hidden flaw, because these cars predated federally mandated shoulder belts, headrests, and crumple zone engineering entirely, relying on simple lap belts alone. An arrangement that felt entirely normal to a driver in 1965, even though it would strike a modern buyer as alarmingly minimal, and the rear-mounted fuel tank design, while entirely conventional for the mid-1960s, later drew scrutiny after federal safety investigators identified an increased fire risk in the event of a serious rear-end collision, a limitation that period owners simply accepted as an unremarkable fact of driving any car built in that particular decade rather than something specific or unusual to the Mustang itself, since virtually every other affordable American car on the road at the time shared broadly similar limitations, and financially, owning one of these cars in period terms meant owning something that held its value and its cultural relevance in a way genuinely unusual for an American economy-derived vehicle, because the car's massive popularity created an almost immediate secondary culture around personalizing and racing these machines, with performance shops and eventually Ford's own in-house Shelby performance division building increasingly potent variants that transformed what had started as a stylish but fundamentally modest commuter car into the foundation of an entire American performance car movement that would define the following decade. A legacy that began quietly in ordinary driveways rather than on a racetrack, with everyday owners who simply wanted their car to look and feel a little quicker than it already did. And looking back at all of it together,